Um, Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Richard for the invite, to Susan and everyone else for their organisational efforts. I think it's been a fantastic conference so far, and the bar's been set really high. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest of it. I want to start really with a couple of admissions regarding this talk. The first one is that I'm a bit of a reluctant convert to the 12th century. I did my PhD on 7th and 8th century Anglo-Saxon settlement archaeology. And I was employed on this research project on the Anarchy, and I went in, a little bit hesitantly. I saw the Normans as pretty square, pretty straight, mainly based on their depiction on the Bayeux Tapestry with their sort of sensible haircuts. I didn't think they were nearly as rock and roll as Harold, sort of Spinal Tap with his mullet and his tash. But actually, I didn't have a Damascene conversion, but working on this project really came to become really compelled by the period, and it's an interest that I retain still today. So I work across the early, late medieval divide, for want of a better term. My other admission is that I came up with the sort of the title for this talk without really sitting down and thinking about what I was going to say initially. It took me a little bit of time, like how am I going to reconcile this incredible character, David, who's being explored in wonderful detail across this conference, with the material culture, with the archaeology that really doesn't fit with those sort of biographies in that same way. It's a different data set, the kind of the Richard III of this world, where the archaeology and the written sources meet in such a profound way, are kind of the exception that proved the rule. And so I kind of got out of this, and my way of doing this is to look at very specific aspect of the anarchy, and indeed of David's campaigns in northern England, and looking at the conflict landscapes. I'm essentially a landscape archaeologist, and I'm just taking one particular aspect today and exploring, can we see the archaeological signatures of David's campaign? And what do they look like? So it's a really toe in the water. It's a really looking at the potential of the archaeological evidence rather than a deep dive detailed survey. So the talks are in a couple of main components. I want to give an introduction to our research projects that we conducted. Also, a tiny introduction to the Anarchy itself. But then I really want to look at the siege works. We did a lot of work, archaeological field work as well as desk-based work, looking at conflict landscapes. I want to give a few results of some of that English work, and then look at a couple of examples at Norman Walk of potential Davidian conflict landscapes. Is that going to work? No. So introducing the Anarchy itself, then, it's quite an intimidating thing to approach in a 2-year project when you've not specialised in the 12th century before. The period has a vast historiography. It's often styled as an English civil war. I think that's pretty problematic, and I think we've already seen that in the conference thus far, and it's something I want to really re-emphasise. And it's seen in a very sort of Anglo-centric way in many times. The term anarchy itself is really problematic. It's much a later confection. It's a term that continues to be contentious. As a project, we kind of perpetuated that, I guess. We continue using the term because it is one that is still widely recognized. If you say, you're studying the anarchy, people do know still what you're talking about. So the main aim of the project that was initiated with Professor Oliver Crichton at Exeter as principal investigator and me as the project officer, ran from 2013 to 2015. And our sort of primary aim and our kind of our sort of broad sort of aim was to look at the overlooked archaeological evidence. What were the material signatures for this period that's really, until I think our work, with some exceptions, been seen through very much a documentary lens. Now, this immediately has some challenges. I think the dating of archaeological evidence is probably the primary one. As I said before, it's usually a data set that's looking at broader processes. So trying to date material culture to a 20-year conflict is quite problematic. But yeah, that was mainly our sort of the thrust of the project. And we did that at a number of scales. Sorry. Ultimately, this resulted in a monograph, but we were looking at all sorts of different scales, right down from the portable material culture and artifacts, going through sites and landscapes, not just siege works, but we looked at things like defended settlements that might date from the period, all the way up to sort of national mapping of different data sets. Archaeological in some cases, things like coinage and artifacts, but at other times also trying to visualize some of those documentary sources, trying to sort of get a real sense of where our documentary coverage was. As I said, that resulted in actually a couple of different volumes, a shameless plug here. The monograph really goes on to look at those different scales. It is structured around, in terms of the chapters, looking at the different material culture. And then this edited volume, which you don't need to pay for, you can get for free if you're interested, just go to the website, which really is the results of our field work. And that's me at Corfe Castle with our res meter, doing all this sorts of work, getting wet in various locations across the country. But it's about 12 or so different case study sites that we investigated within that. Now, the period called the Anarchy is essentially Stephen's reign. I've already heard from the audience, you're clearly a very well-read, well-understood audience, so I'm not going to dwell on this for too long. Essentially, the succession crisis that happens when Henry I dies, the death of his only son leads to a bit of a power vacuum. He does his best, as we heard in the questions last night from Richard, to ensure that his legitimate daughter, Matilda, Empress Matilda, will comes to the throne. But on his death, Stephen quickly hops across the water, crowns himself king, and then we have this kind of protracted conflict across 19 long winters when Christ and his saints slept, as it says in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. David, of course, has an absolutely key role in all of this as uncle of Matilda, comes on the Angevin side. So when I use those terms throughout today, we tend to call Stephen royal. We tend to refer to Matilda and her side as Angevin. That's partly because she didn't successfully get herself crowned. She tried and gets chased out of London by a mob. So those are some of the key background and the key context. What is really significant about this conflict, from an archaeological and I think a broader sense, is that it really lacks battles. You think 20-year civil war almost, and there are only 2 pitched battles the entire time. One is at Northallerton, the Battle of the Standard, in which David is involved. I'll briefly cover that in just a second. And the other is at the Battle of Lincoln. They occur quite early in the conflict. There are other skirmishes and other, armed interactions, but overwhelmingly, it is siege warfare that dominates. And that's what I really want to focus on today. It's actually notable that in this second large battle, it emerges as a byproduct of a siege. Stephen is besieging the city of Lincoln, and then an Angevin force coming from the south actually come and meet him. So it's siege warfare that dominates. Now, the Battle of Standard, in many ways, the exception that proves the rule, because it is really, as I said, a pitched battle, and it's not really typical of the conflict. It happens in August 1138. In January of that year, David had begun a campaign into the north, including sieges at Norham and Wark, and those are the places we're going to explore a little bit later. The Scots moving south on the Great North Road meet an English army arranged on a ridge. The exact location's been a little bit debated. We think it's actually probably a bit further south than it's been suggested before. Essentially, it results in an English victory, an English army composed of some militia, some local troops from the Yorkshire region. Bishop Thurston is key in raising that army. A few things happen. The Galwegians, as we heard yesterday, demand their sort of right to go first, if you like. They're probably in a way funneled by the sort of local landscape. We just saw the value of different field names in reconstruction historic landscape, and they're useful here. It suggests that both sides of the Great North Road, just north of Northallerton, are actually quite marshy and boggy. So when the Scots are meeting the English line, and it does sound that the conflict is actually happening in that way, that the English are relatively static, but the Scots are almost being sort of funneled by the topography. The Galwegians are successfully repelled by the English army. It's got an amazing line that says, the Galwegians are like a hedgehog with its quill. I did send that to my friend from Kirkcudbright, who didn't massively like it. We then see another stage that Prince Henry, on the Scottish side, leads a cavalry charge, which is an interestingly Norman method. At the very start of the battle, the English make a real point in their opening speeches to their own troops at how barbaric and savage the Scots are, and how essentially how foreign they are as well. And I thought it was fascinating yesterday, the kind of the way in which historians have used the battle methods and also sort of appropriated ethnic identities to these in examples like the Battle of the Standard. Ultimately, there is a Scots defeat, and David retreats, and he resumes the siege of Wark, which ultimately falls in November after a bit of a hiatus. In terms of the archaeological evidence of the Battle of the Standard, there's not a huge amount. I think if we were doing the project again now, I think we would actually probably undertake some battlefield archaeology. Metal detecting is an increasingly valuable method actually for this sort of landscape. The key thing in terms of placing the action is probably this here. It's called the Scots Pit, which actually remains as an earthwork and visible and marked on Ordnance Survey maps until the 19th century. So this could well be a mass grave. It's certainly somewhere that would be worthy of doing further archaeological investigation. Something like a radar, which again, increasingly well used, would actually pick that up. And this on the bottom here is Scots Pitch Lane, which actually perpetuates the broad location. But in terms of the archaeological signature, battlefields of this period, they're not massively profound. It's very, very hard, very ephemeral archaeology to identify and characterize. You might have been here, if you're a geek like me, on a lay-by on the Great North Road. There is a monument to the battle, but it's easily missed. Instead, as I said, far more characteristic than the big battles in the period are sieges. And Wallingford is an exceptional case study in demonstrating how sieges kind of played out. Wallingford in Oxfordshire. This is a site of 3 different Anarchy period sieges across the war. It's an interesting place well before the Anarchy. It's notable as the sites where William the Conqueror crosses the Thames. Earlier than that, it's an Anglo-Saxon burh, one of these defended places, some of which become towns and listed in the Burgle Hidage. It's got this very distinctive, sort of almost D-shaped, playing card-shaped enclosure, which is the burh itself. The first siege, drawing upon the documentary evidence, suggests that 2 royal siege castles are built. Probably the first one across the bridge at a place called Crowmarsh. This place is very, very interesting. It seems to be the location of repeated siege works. The idea that sieges aren't just a single event, but actually we're locations where there are various sieges. We get probably sites that are being decommissioned and recommissioned. Again, it's very, very interesting. We then see the second siege. Again, as I said, probably a counter castle is built or reactivated. Not much archaeology relating to that. And then we see a third siege much later in the war, and that actually is towards the end of the conflict, and we see the Treaty of Wallingford, it's sometimes called, in the wake of that. What's very interesting, I think, about the third siege is that a relatively peaceful resolution to that, but Henry of Anjou, who will become Henry II, one of the things he does in one account is that he beheads 60 archers, which seems a bit mean to say the least. Archers are really reviled. And, the big question, why do we have this conflict with so few big battles? And I think an element of that is just the risk that was inherent in fighting these big pitched battles, especially to the elites. And archers are particularly reviled for their role in that. They can kill indiscriminately. They can kill high status people, low status people. Sieges allow a measure of control. I think there's an element of that, a measure of kind of the conflict being choreographed. And reading the sources and looking at the archaeology, you really get a sense of that. You really get a sense that this is a conflict with some, clear rules and modes of warfare. The archaeology of the Wallingford area itself, they did actually find in 2007 the siege work at Crowmarsh, probably the one that is reactivated 3 times. The clues in the place name of this new housing development. This just goes to show, though, some of the kind of the pressures that archaeology can become under at different times. Because this was when, the time of the recession, 2007, this big ditch you can actually see here is clearly the Stefanik siege work. They knew what it was. It was never fully excavated. These are really rare sites. They're very kind of unusual that we get full excavation. But as I said, it's probably contemporary, economic pressures that never led to it being fully investigated. And that's the reconstruction that Ollie had commissioned. This is the Crowmarsh site, perhaps with another siege works next to it, the Wallingford Bridge, and the castle and town that it would have been besieging. Now, places like this and places like Corfe give an idea that siege works were probably very, very close, that they must have been essentially just out of arrow shot, a couple hundred meters away. We do get examples of that. Corfe is another one, but it's not completely typical. At Corfe, we have a slightly unusual example of a ringwork and bailey. We usually get motts and baileys, but at Corfe we have a ringwork. We undertook geophysical survey, but also topographic survey. This is the ringwork here and with a bailey. Very interesting that it's then rebooted again in the Civil War of the 17th century, becomes known as Cromwell's Battery from that point onward. I also really want to make note of this feature here, this kind of outwork you can see. These siege works, in terms of internal space, are tiny, really, relatively speaking. There's no way that a substantial army could be billeted in a location like that. And there's a few examples we identified in the project, castles, sometimes even churches, with these sorts of outworks. And you do wonder whether these might relate to billeting of soldiers in the wider landscape. So we do have those examples of almost like assaulting works, if you like, siege work being very close to the castle or the town that they seek to besiege. But what we noticed, and we noticed really from the outset, was far more common, is we almost see sort of blockading works, siege castles seemingly built at quite a remove from the castle they seek to besiege, sometimes 2, 3, 4 kilometres away. A really good example of that is Cams Hill in Wiltshire, where Malmesbury, the Malmesbury Abbey, is probably the site of the castle there. Cams Hill, an apparent siege work, is a good kilometre or so and not even intervisible with the castle itself. This diagram here is actually essentially four of the same image. And this is what we call sort of a view shed. The areas in light is the area that's sort of primarily visible. And that's at 4 different heights, at 0 meters, 3, 5, and 7. Essentially what that is showing is that at Cams Hill, which is the blue dot here, the primary visibility is all towards the river. It's not towards the castle itself at all. And so we really see that quite strongly coming through in various different examples of siege work seemingly looking to control movement, perhaps control movement of resources, of troops, rather than being, there as an assaulting installation. Same sort of thing at Hampstead Marshall as well. The castle there that was probably being besieged a good distance away, over 1 kilometre away. The view shed suggesting, again, that it's the river that is the primary significance here. The kind of ultimate example of that, and the idea that sort of siege castles were built to control movement and blockade in a broader sense, we actually see in this example of the Fenton landscape, when Geoffrey de Mandeville leads an uprising against Stephen and ultimately dies in this conflict. Stephen establishes a range of different castles around the Fen Edge, besieging the island of Ely. So again, it's that sense of blockading that is the primary archaeological signature. So when we're looking for siege works, we shouldn't be looking, 200, 300 meters from a castle necessarily, but in the wider landscape. What is notable, and it's worth stressing, is quite how consistent the archaeology of siege works are. Um, Mottes, Baileys, ringworks. Takes a lot of effort to build. This is the excavated example of Danes Castle in Exeter. They're quite chunky things. The internal area is quite small, but quite an achievement to actually get them commissioned. It would have taken a huge amount of human power. But their form is relatively consistent, and that is helpful for us because it allows us to think about them when we don't have documentary sources for them. We were a little bit guilty, so this is a little bit of a mea culpa of being led, I suppose, by one of the key sources of the Anarchy, this document called the Gesta Stephani, the Deeds of Stephen, which really locates most of the action along the M4 corridor. It was clearly a key area of conflict. It's very interesting, actually, that this landscape, sort of North Wiltshire, South Gloucestershire, is an area of interface in the early medieval period and also in the Iron Age as well. So there's something longer lasting going on. But also the authorship, it's almost certainly the Bishop of Bath who's writing this text, and he clearly knows that location better than others. So we did map that. We've kind of drawn to a lot of the sites in this landscape. And that's what it looks like in terms of a national picture. But bringing in some of the other sources that we've heard about, we get a slightly more balanced view. And I want to just have a very brief look at the potential archaeological evidence for sieges further north, and perhaps ones relating to the Davidian campaign. So do we see siege marks on the Tweed? I'm not sure where that digimap watermarks come from. Apologies for that. But essentially, we're going to look at Norham initially, but also at Walk as well, and look at whether we can see any archaeology for sieges in these landscapes. Now, Norham, you guys will probably know far better than me. It's held by the Prince Bishops of Durham at various times. First mentioned in 1121 and built by Bishop Flambard. Might have started life as a wooden keep with a palisade. Certainly by the early 12th century, there's a donjon built as a single two-storied vault, explored by Dixon and Marshall, very interesting piece of architectural assessment. A keep is then added late in the 12th century and a curtain wall constructed. David besieged and captured Norham in 1136 and 1138 with that hiatus, and it's slighted after that second siege. Now, in the wider landscape, can we find potential Davidian siege works? And I think we can. The strongest candidate I've got for siege work in this presentation is actually the first, and it's located about a kilometre, again on the river, location called Fairfield. Noted on historic ordnance survey maps, as you can see to the left, that's Fairfield up here. And it seems to be depicted as a ringwork. This is what the LiDAR shows. You can just see that slightly ephemeral shape there. And it should come through a bit stronger there. Now, it has been recognized, this. Again, it's not great on this screen. The light's not fantastic. It has been recognized by the Historic Environment Record, this thing, but I think misidentified. They think it's a Motte and Bailey. The form of this thing is much more consistent with a 12th century ringwork. It's interesting that in 1955, there's quite a detailed account of how the farmer tried to flatten it. Again, it's not scheduled, not protected, very typical of archaeology of the 12th century. It doesn't necessarily fit massively well categorized definitions. The kind of southern side of it is definitely getting eroded into the Tweed. So this is archaeology at risk as well. As I say, classes are Motte and Bailey, but this looks far more like a ringwork. Just to stress how consistent this is with other Anarchy period archaeology. This is what Cam's Hill looks like. Look how it's depicted on the Ordnance Survey. That perfect circular ringwork. This is not being eroded, but it is exactly the same sort of riverine location as we see elsewhere. So I think this sort of Fairfield Castle, if you like, has to be a real contender as a Davidian siege work. On the other side of Norham, we've got a couple of candidates, Green Hill and Horncliffe. Check the time. Horncliffe Fort might be Iron Age. We tend to call things Iron Age when we don't necessarily know the date of them. But just look at the reuse of Iron Age hill forts that we see elsewhere in the Anarchy. And this is at Hales Abbey, for example, where an Iron Age hill fort is a Motte Bailey is inserted into it. And we see it quite broadly. At Green Hill as well, we've got this mysterious thing, again called Iron Age. This looks like the faint outline, again, of a Motte and Bailey potential. No archaeological work has been done really at either, but the potential here is clearly quite huge. I really want to finish very briefly with Walk. The evidence here is not nearly as impressive, but again, it's a focus of sieges by David and is built and later extended throughout the 12th century and afterwards. Here we might be seeing the reuse of potential early church enclosure, a place called Carham. There's lots of evidence to suggest that Carham is an important church and perhaps a residence well before the 12th century. We have this enclosure, which is probably the church enclosure, but just like at Cork, we seem to have this outwork on the and sort of the refortification of churches and the addition of churches with kind of military to give a more military aspect is quite common and something we explored in the project. On the other side of Wark, again a few kilometres down the river, we have Kippy Hill. This is really sort of jumping the shark here, but we do have a kind of a potential Motte type feature here. It was dug in the 19th century, however, and it does look like a Bronze Age barrow, but that shouldn't really put us off that these landscape features weren't rebooted and reused in the later period. Okay, I've kind of rushed through and badly timed that perhaps slightly, but I just want to finish by saying, the archaeology of the Anarchy is ephemeral, especially the battlefield setting. Thankfully, sieges are common. We can find them far more easily archaeologically, and we can explore them. And it just shows also that these castles are not all nasty, brutish and tall, as they sometimes have been styled. We really neglected the potential of the Davidian, signatures in our work. So it's a bit of a mea culpa here. But we're looking at the same material signatures and the common modes of warfare across Britain, and there's clear potential for further work. So if anyone wants to collaborate, I'll be very happy. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.